pardon the quick share screen do over here. And you can see here is the ChatGPT screen. For those of you who might not be familiar with ChatGPT, just to get there, you just type in ChatGPT. I'll show, and right there in Google, right? Pulls up, and here we go. And my screen is extremely large right now, so I'm going to see if I can't make this a little smaller. Let me zoom out a little bit here. Here we go. And so the first thing I think about is, okay, one of the things that's important to us is promotional practices and things like that. So let's say I am a police chief in Waco, Texas. Please develop a sergeant's testing process. I want to be able to evaluate for some of the relational leadership skills, things like servant leadership, discipline, and going from buddy to boss, right? So we do a great job in public safety, I think, in terms of evaluating some of the technical skill sets. I think if I'm going to be, kind of honest about where we need improvement on, it's how do we evaluate those soft skills that are going to be necessary for being a leader, right? And if you think about just the importance of the sergeant, and on the fire side, the captain, that crew lead position in our organizations. These are the ones that I think are probably one of the most important positions in our organizations, especially in public safety. And so we want to see, okay, what can we do to start developing that and to start testing for that way we know what that looks like. And so here we have kind of a basic overview of a testing process with a written examination, behavioral assessments, situational judgment tests, role-playing exercises, and things like that. So some things that some ways that we can maybe evaluate some of those relational skills, not relational leadership skills. I could take this, I could modify, obviously, I could go, I could change a couple things in here. I could incorporate this with my technical skill set that I want to have. But maybe it dawns on me that, do you know what? If I'm going to be testing for these types of skills, I really need to be developing officers. That way they're ready to be able to promote, kind of that pre-promotional process. And so let's ask, okay, what are some ways that I can train and develop officers so that they're ready for these types of skills, these types of evaluation process? So we can say, what are some strategies for developing officers so they can be ready to lead as servant leaders? And in case you were unaware, so one of the reasons why I'm doing this with servant leaders is not just because of SGR's focus on servant leadership. It's actually so that, and again, I'll limit my etymology nerding out to this alone. So the word sergeant is actually an old French word that means servant. And so embedded into the word sergeant and this idea of being a sergeant as the first leader really is that idea of servant leadership. And so that's why I wanted to focus on that, particularly for sergeant development testing. So here we have some leadership development programs, maybe some mentorship things, some field experience, the community engagement, reflective practices, ethics and integrity training, promoting team collaboration. And again, we could do the exact same thing with, say, code enforcement and our development with that. We do the same thing with our development of fire service, and going from firefighter to captain, or from captain to maybe the lieutenant in between there, from captain to battalion chief. Same idea. But we can see here just in a few minutes, few seconds really, we had all these different ideas that we can take. Now, we're going to want to evaluate, want to see what works, what doesn't work, adopt it and adapt it to our local jurisdiction and the needs of our local jurisdiction and the specific needs of our people and what makes sense there. So that's just kind of a basic, and we can do this So this is something you can do on ChatGPT 3.5. You just, this is not the paid version of it in terms of what this can produce right here. So you can do this exact same thing no matter what. Now, I do want to show some of the things you can do with ChatGPT 4, which is the ChatGPT Plus model. So let me do this here. I'm going to start a new chat. And I want to bring in we're going to bring in some data sets. Okay. So we're going to talk about data-driven policing. And that's a huge, very much a push over the last at least 10 plus years or close to 10 years now. So let's bring in some data and see what we can do, see what we can gather here. Now, the data I'm bringing in is data that's open source available. There's Bloomington, Indiana has a lot of their data sets publicly available on a dashboard. So all the information I'm going to get in is already publicly available. And I say that just because you might see some things in here that, depending on your jurisdiction, your level of liability and risk tolerance, you may not feel comfortable releasing. And I don't want to advocate for releasing information that you don't feel comfortable releasing. So Bloomington, Indiana, felt that this was an appropriate thing to release. And so luckily for us, we get to play around with their data and I get to see some results from it too. So what we're going to do first is let me pull in, and these are going to be some pretty large data sets here. And so the first thing I want to bring in is some nuisance complaints. So these are just general nuisance complaints. And I first want to do, I'm just going to ask it to look at the data and evaluate and kind of just get a sense of what this data is. So I'm just going to say, please just review this data so you know what it is. And I do this just that way it doesn't get too overwhelmed with it. It also gives me an opportunity to grab a quick drink of coffee here while it's analyzing all of the data here. This is a pretty massive spreadsheet. Okay, so it's going to identify the different case number, date, time, month, weekday, nature of the complaint, address, district, report, georeference, things like that. Okay, cool. So that's one of the first data set I want to bring in. And what I'm doing here, I'm going to try to do is I want to bring in different data sets and then show the connectivity, show the through line between this, and show how we can unlock insights beyond and looking beyond the case or the incident that's just right in front of us. So there's the first data set. Second one I'm going to do here is, let's see here. I'm going to bring this down just a tad bit because my Zoom screen is covering up my tabs here. Second thing I want to bring in is I want to bring in some rental properties. So I'm going to export, I already have exported the rental properties there. Just give you an idea of what I'm bringing in here. So I'm going to upload the rental properties here. I'm just going to say, do the same for this. So again, it's going to analyze it. It's going to understand what the report is and things like that. And so this way we can kind of get a sense of rental properties. And you'll maybe by now you're kind of seeing what I'm thinking through and how I'm approaching this problem set, so to speak. But we'll do this here, and then we'll do one more as well too, and see if we can get one more thing here. So it's giving me all these different rental properties, some permitting that's there, contact city, zip and address data. So perfect. I'm going to bring one more in here, and this is fire incident responses. I'm going to say now the same for this too, please. You don't have to say please and thank you. I do. That way, it just my thought is when the AI overlords take over, they'll remember that I said please and thank you to them, and maybe I'll get off a little bit easier. So that's just, yeah. But actually there's something, so as we go through here, so here's the fire incident responses containing data regarding fire incident responses breakdown here. Okay, so here now I have my nuisance ones, I have my rental properties, I have my fire incident responses. I'm gonna try to do one more and see if we can do one more, and then we'll kind of tie this all together and see what this looks like. I'm gonna bring in, this one is calls for service. So here's our calls for service. And I'm just asking to bring this into and just review for now. So what I have here, what I've uploaded into the ChatGPT, I've uploaded, or we're gonna upload the nuisance calls for service. We also brought in some rental property data. We brought in fire calls for service, and now we have calls for service from the police department. So this is all from Bloomington, Indiana. They're all their data that they have here. So now let's say I am a deputy city manager overseeing public safety for the city of Bloomington, Indiana. I want to understand the relationships between nuisance nuisance data and fire and police calls for service. So that's what I'm looking at is I want to see, okay, what are the ways in which what are the through lines? Maybe what are the correlations? What are the overlaps that we have here? So what's going to do is it's going to go through and integrate the data sets based on spatial and temporal attributes. Basically what that means for those of us who are not data savvy like myself, what that means is basically they're going to look at maybe some address joins, so matching addresses, and also matching days and times for that. So I'm going to ask you to start with this with a temporal analysis. Start with a temporal analysis, and let's just focus on data from 2023. So it's going to go through, going to analyze it, going to pull these things together. And you think about the amount of work that this would typically take staff. Okay, so we would typically have a dedicated person doing this. And really, think about this too. Typically, what you would have is you might have an analyst within your fire department and an analyst within your police department, maybe an analyst within your development services team. But they'd have to all work together and get on the same page. Think of the scheduling conflicts of that too, which would be very difficult. Here, we can really allow them not to have to go too deep into the pulling the data. Now they can focus on the analysis part of it, digging deeper into it. So it's going to perform the temporal analysis for us, identify patterns or trends over the months in 2023 for each data set. We'll examine how the frequencies of these incidents vary by month, and it'll help us understand if there are any specific times of the year where incidents peak or decline, potentially indicating seasonal trends or the impact of seasonal events. So here is some of the data we get here. Calls for service generally high throughout the year, with peaks in August and September, some fire incidents. And that makes sense too. So if you think about Bloomington, Indiana being a college town, I think IU is located there. So that makes sense. Some peaks around August and September based on that. Fire incidents also peak in August, which aligns with the peak in calls for service. That's kind of interesting, right? So our peaks in calls for service for police department is also peaking along the same time as our fire incidents, right? Kind of interesting there. So now let's go ahead, and what I want to see here too is what about matching addresses in 2023. What locations were we're trying to think how I'm going to word this. Basically, I'm looking to see is what locations were repeatedly responded to. So I want to see is, okay, what are the locations that maybe are I hate to use the word hot spots, but I think I don't have a better word for it. But what are the locations that maybe need some more attention, some more care, and maybe a different strategy, maybe a different approach to how we're doing things instead of just responding to the call. What are the ones that we're looking for? So it's going to go back and see. They can't find the address column right now. Hopefully, they can go back. I think they had it in all the different data sets. We should be good there. Hopefully, we'll get in luck here. So, but what we're looking to see is, okay, Okay, so the calls for service data set does not include an address column. We can only perform data analysis for addresses and nuisance and fire incidents. And I'm going to say, yes, just do nuisance and fire. This will also be interesting too, right? Is, okay, what are the ones, and maybe we can see, are there calls for service happening at nuisance addresses that, because we're not appropriately addressing them, they're resulting in fires, they're resulting in calls for service from the fire department. And maybe we can find that here. So here are the top responses that had the most responses for nuisance and complaints and fire incidents in 2023. So what we can do with this now is we can say, okay, can you give me a interactive map of those addresses? So now we can actually go in and like take a look at these addresses and see, and I'm guessing, and this is just my gut feeling, but I look at, like, for instance, 6 and 7 Henderson Street, 2446 South Henderson Street, and 2440 South Henderson Street. I'm guessing those might be interrelated to each other, right? Those might be some of the same addresses there. So it's going to try to build this out for me and see what this is. And we'll go a step further after this is done analyzing, but you can kind of see, like, the depth of the data we can get into in terms of seeing beyond the seeing beyond the incident that's in front of us, seeing, okay, we have a nuisance call. Well, is that escalating into a fire call? And if we had better address data within our calls for service data, which hopefully you do, then we can see what that does for police calls for service. So it's going to try to address this here and create a map for us. While it's doing that, I'm going to grab another gulp of coffee here. So it's kind of refined its approach. And this is one of the things I like about ChatGPT as well, is it's not just going to come to a place of, oh, I can't do it, and just give up. It often goes beyond and tries to think through different ways of doing it. It's also the reason why I like using different tools. So often what I'll do is I'll use a tool called Julius, which I talked about in the last webinar, AI for finance. So if you want to go back and watch that and learn more about how to leverage Julius, we could do the same kind of thing here in Julius as well too. And maybe we might have that luck in this creating a map. Let's be fine. After this last one, I'll go a different direction. But I think you can kind of get the point of what we're trying to do here and see this, right? Obviously, we could plot those points on a map using a GeoJSON file, or or working with our GIS team or things like that too. So here we go. Let's see what we got here. It's not able to give me the map. Let's see if I can. I'll go back to this in a second. Come on, do one more thing before I get here. Maybe, like I said, maybe we'll get lucky. What I'm also curious about is, I'm curious as to whether those top addresses also appear in the rental addresses list. Because, okay, so so this is something that might be interesting too, is, okay, are these rental properties, and maybe it's not an issue of the residents who are necessary, or the tenants who are necessarily the root of the concern, especially with nuisance or code enforcement, things like that. But maybe there are the landlords we focus on. So it appears that none of the top addresses for nuisance and fire incidents are listed in the rental properties data set. Okay, so we're dealing with more permanent residents of the city of Bloomington. So let's ask this. Let's just ask it, based on the connections between nuisance and fire data, what insights can I gather from that? And we can start having a deeper conversation to see what are the different insights I can gather. What are the ways in which I can look at this data beyond the incident that's right in front of me. So we look at resource allocation, preventative measures if addresses consistently see high levels of nuisance and fire incidents. We could also look at policy development that overlap in addresses with high nuisance and fire incidents can inform policy adjustments or development of new regulations, community engagement. We also look at cross-agency collaboration, data-driven decision-making, urban planning and development. So these are different insights we can gather from this data to see, okay, what does this data mean? How do I do this? And what are the ways in which I can see beyond the case that's in front of me? So I'm gonna go over to a different platform. Before I do that, I'm gonna try to get to build a map one more time for me while we're working on a different platform. Maybe I can scare it and make it jealous that I'm using a different AI platform. So I'm gonna say, try making that map one more time and download as an HTML file. So while we're doing that, I'm going to go over here to another tool, this Claude, right? And we're going to sign again. You just got to sign in with an email, or I sign with my Google account. So pretty easy there. I gave you all my email address, so please don't send me spam emails. I'm kidding. You can send me all the emails you want to send. I'd love to interact and talk with you guys. So let's focus here, right? And so we talked about police, the police testing process, and now let's talk about fire side of things, right? And so I can ask, okay, I am a fire chief in, I'm gonna say Dubuque, Iowa, and I am interested in how to reimagine my budget as a EMS first provider, because 80% of my calls for service are medical in nature and less than 10% are fire. And so this is actually a real thing too, right? So I'm not just making these statistics up. This is actually pretty accurate in terms of where I work. It's different. So fires are typically caused by one of the predictors of fire is age of buildings, and so we're seeing this trend throughout the U.S. really is with fire-based EMS. A majority of our calls for service are EMS in nature. So things like cardiac arrests, drownings, unfortunately, and the different, also just kind of someone forgot to take their medication, needs a call out to help out with that. So different things. So we're spending a lot of time on EMS, and appropriately so. So we want to think through, okay, hey, if we're spending all this time on EMS, if that's the priority for our department and for our efforts as a community, how do I engage in those strategies? What are some things I can do? So we can look at, here's some ways, it's going to give me some ideas of how to approach this. We look at analyze call data, investing in EMS training equipment, definitely appropriate. Adjust staffing, consider adjusting your staffing model to have more paramedics and EMTs on duty during peak hours for medical calls. Collaborate with local healthcare providers. On the adjust staffing, there's some nuances there that I completely understand. So this is why you're going to want to have domain expertise as you go through this, and not just trust the AI model, because the AI model, to my knowledge, has never run a fire call, has never run a medic call before, but you in the fire service and the EMS service have done that. So you know what that looks like. So talking about collaborate with local healthcare providers, implement community paramedicine programs, invest in public education. And so I look at, okay, implement community paramedicine programs. I can look at this, copy this right here, paste it down here, and say, how can I do this? I am particularly interested in how to do this within my dispatch so I can make sure we are deploying the right response the first time. So here we go. It's talk about establishing some clear protocols, training the dispatchers, integrating with the existing dispatch software, creating a dedicated community paramedicine team, developing partnerships with like local health care providers, hospitals, clinics, primary care physicians. So it's giving me some different strategies that I could take and say, okay, maybe I want to run with one or two or three, or maybe even it gives me an idea and I would go a different direction, but I still have the idea launched from chatting with ChatGPT and see what we can produce here. So these are different things we can do within AI and how we can really unlock the full potential of our city and see what we can do and thinking through and saying, okay, just because we've done it this way before doesn't mean it's the best way to do it going forward. And so what is the best way to do it going forward? You know, some things that we've even just something as simple as like, does this make like, what are the implications of doing this? What are the second and third order effects of going this direction? So we could say, okay, what are the negative impacts of a community paramedicine program? So maybe you want to evaluate both sides of it too and think through this kind of more critically. So it's going to talk about some of the negative impacts to consider, scope of practice, liability issues, some of the funding challenges, resistance from other healthcare providers. So making sure your stakeholders are involved and aligned appropriately, overextending EMS resources, some of the patient privacy concerns. And there's also talking about some of the limiting evidence of long-term impact and workforce retention and things like that. So these are things that we want to think through critically, of not just saying, hey, like with AI, I can get AI to write a positive response in anything, right? That's the AI model is designed to basically write and generate a response to your question. So it's important to us to make sure we're asking the right questions as well too. And that's why we have fire chiefs and police chiefs and department heads and city managers and deputy city managers and resources like SGR to help us think things through more critically and at a strategic level, as opposed to just having an idea and running with it because we can find someone to agree with us. So this is some things we can do here too, right? Let's also talk about, and I'm going to go check on our ChatGPT. Maybe we got lucky and maybe we were able to do that. And we did. So here is the downloaded map. I'm going to open this up here in a second. I don't think you can see it quite yet, but in a second, I'll show you this. And here is our map of Bloomington. Let's see if we can find where the different address points are. Doesn't look like it plotted the addresses very well for me. Maybe it was a different color. Oh, I see it. It's like all down here. See if I can get this zoomed in a little bit so you can see where this is at. I'm going to zoom in here. So if you see these kind of clusters over here, I think this is somewhere where the addresses are here. But obviously we could go in and change that. But I want to show you that even in ChatGPT, we can actually create visualization. We can create maps of this. We can create those type of insights and data there. Going back to this idea of evaluating ideas and rethinking things through. Another thing that's of importance to us in public safety is the need for hiring dispatchers. We talked about the critical shortage of dispatch hiring and things like that. So maybe AI can help us reimagine how we're hiring dispatchers for a more streamlined process, one that's still not going to, we're not going to decrease our standards. We're not going to do anything like that. We want to streamline our process and see what we can find here. So I'm going to say I am a dispatch manager, and for this, I'm going to say a public safety dispatch manager, just get it context. That way they know we're not talking about, Old Dominion Frightline or something like that. So I'm a public safety dispatch manager, and I want to completely reimagine our hiring practices. We currently have, let's say, 5 vacancies in our dispatch center, and it's taking us about 5 months to find qualified candidates. What are some things I can do to attract talent and bring them in faster. So here we go. It's going to look at this. And as we're talking about this, so we used a very similar approach to this kind of idea with our department. So in our city, we started the year 2023. I think we had about 14 or 15 vacancies in the police department. And we sat down with our HR team. This is an example of collaboration across departments, right? So we sat down with our HR department. I had some ideas generated through AI. Sat down there with our HR department and our police department and said, okay, it's taking us 6 months to hire people and bring them on board. What are ways we can do to make that faster? And we did. We made it extremely fast. We streamlined the processes together. We combined some of our testing into one day, so having different days and having to schedule that out. And as a result of that, and some of the dedicated efforts that our police department put into things, and the phenomenal work that our police chief and our HR team have done, we're now sitting with, I think we have 2 vacancies right now, and those 2 vacancies are a result of having added 3 new positions mid-year. So we did some phenomenal work, and that just speaks to, number one, the power of collaboration across different departments, of not being isolated, of seeing a big picture and aligning to our city's mission, and also the things we can do with AI and the generation of ideas through AI. So here's some different things it talks about, like streamlining the application process, enhancing job listings, leveraging social media, partnering with educational institutions, offering internships and part-time roles, focusing on branding, competitive compensation, referral programs, and accelerating the background check and training processes. So I'm gonna highlight this and say, give me some ideas on how to do this. So talk about pre-screening some candidates early, conduct initial screens through interviews or short assessments before the detailed background checks. That also can be a cost-saving factor as well too, because background checks do cost some money. And so if you pre-screen, that can be a very helpful way to not only accelerate the time process, but also save budget dollars at the same time too. You can also employ automated background check services, consolidate vendors. If you use multiple vendors for different parts of a background check, consider consolidating the services under one vendor to streamline communication processing times. I think we actually did something kind of the opposite of that, where we used multiple vendors because our vendors were getting clogged up into they're getting too clogged up there in terms of the pipeline. So continuous monitoring, in terms of streamlining training processes, do modular-based training, online learning platforms, do some cross-training strategies, some mentorship programs, feedback-driven improvements. So these are just all the different ways in which we can leverage AI and leverage these things for data. We saw this from, if we think about kind of a quick recap here, we first talked about, okay, developing the soft skills and evaluating the soft skills for our sergeant testing process and how that could also be used for captain testing processes. And then we looked at, okay, let's go into some data-driven analysis and see what are the through lines between nuisance calls for service from the police side, code enforcement, into fire, and what are the addresses that are common. We were able, in a very crude way, to kind of map some of those addresses out. Obviously, we would want to make sure that map was accurate and more visibly appealing and really told the story the right way. And then also we looked at, okay, what are some of the strategies we can do to look at if 80% of my calls for service are EMS based? What are some of the strategies I can employ to make sure that my budget reflects that as a priority for our community? And then also finally looked at, okay, in our dispatch hiring processes, what are some of the ways in which we can be more innovative and think outside the box and completely reimagine our dispatch hiring, and hopefully from there achieve and retain qualified individuals as dispatchers who, that's such an important part of our job and such an important part of our community is our dispatchers, often forgotten. But I know all the police officers and firefighters that I've ever talked to deeply appreciate our dispatchers. So I want to end on that note. And with that, Mike, I will turn things back over to you and see if there's any Q&A or anything like that from our fine folks here.
Yeah, well, man, great presentation, Mike. I love that so much, and a great job. And I just started thinking there at the end. You can use generative AI as you're making decisions about sort of groundbreaking things to allow you to think about stuff that you might not think about and prepare a plan. One question came up, and we could really do a whole webinar on this. So this might be one for us to do in the future, but if you could just maybe briefly address the issue of the importance from your perspective of creating policies for the use of generative AI. So this is something that we're hearing a lot about. What's your take on that, and how would you recommend the city approach that?
So really, I would want to look at a couple things. Number one, I would want to identify what is the goal of this policy? What do I want to do with it, right? And then from there, once I've identified what the goal is, then I'm going to look at the existing policy framework. All of us already have policies on internet usage, on computer usage, and things like that. And so I want to see, does my existing policy framework already cover this, or is there something different and more unique? And then from there, I develop a policy. One of the things that also occurs to me too, Mike, is a lot of the policy conversation is about verifying information and preventing inaccuracies and things like that. To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a policy dedicated towards AI generated content if the same thing doesn't also apply to human generated content as well. And so I want to make sure we're consistent and just being consistent in terms of highlighting the need for accuracy and highlighting the need for excellence in the content that we're producing.
Yeah, great point. And these are going to be issues that every organization and agency is going to have to wrestle with. We can't just put our heads in the sand and act like this isn't happening, or that it's not going to be an important part of local government's future in almost every department. So we may tackle that one a little bit later on. You and I can talk about that. But man, great job. Thank you so much, Micah. We really appreciate it. Really appreciate everyone that's joined in. You can catch this episode, like all of our webinars, on our YouTube channel. You'll be getting a link to that sometime afterwards, and you can share that. We want everyone to watch it. And then I want to just put in a plug-in for next week. We have our good friend Randy Mayhew, who is going to be sharing a book briefing on a fascinating book called The Right Call. It's by Sally Jenkins, great author, and she's written a tremendous book about sports and how it ties into leadership. And if you like that sort of thing, and frankly, I love it. And I've read this book. It's great. So you'll want to be a part of it. So thank you again, Micah. Thank you, Lisa and Sarah, for your work behind the scenes. And thank you for all you do in local government and for being a part of our webinar. And we'll see you down the road.